especially to Professor Jackson, Rosemary McBride, and all of the wonderful people at the University of Otago for putting on this conference and for having me here to speak. In this morning's opening keynote, Professor Katie talked about warism and asked how we can dismantle it. Well, that's exactly what I want to talk about. The belief that war is necessary, or even a normal part of international relations, is a central tenet of the school of political thought known as political realism. Political realists believe that politics as a matter of might is right. This is the dominant school of political thought across the globe, and certainly among the world's superpowers and the countries conducting the global arms race. And it is largely based on a guy named Hobbes. Now, Hobbes was not the first political realist. That honor may go to Thucydides. But it is Hobbes who constructed the most detailed, comprehensive, and psychologically nuanced portrait of why we will always have war. Hobbes is so central to political realism that you can paraphrase one to describe the other. And it is Hobbes' philosophy that is being taught in IR and security studies departments in the universities in the major superpowers. The explanation of why war is a permanent feature of the landscape and why its opposite, pacifism, is an unrealistic pipe dream, again and again comes down to Hobbesian logic. So making any progress with pacifism, I think, among the global superpowers requires addressing Hobbes, dismantling Hobbes, and specifically Hobbes' argument that the state of nature is war of every man against every man. That's an important sentence. The state of nature is war of every man against every man. It's the distillation of his whole argument. To understand it, it's important to note a couple of things. One, the state of nature does not refer to some distant past when humans were living more harmonious with nature, or more naturally, or anything like that. It refers to any society without a leader capable of enforcing rules through the threat of overwhelming force. This force usually boils down to some kind of violence. For example, in the US, where I'm from, if you don't keep an agreement, say you don't pay your mortgage, you may be initially fined, but if you don't pay the fine, agents of the state will eventually come and take your house. And if you refuse to leave and resist, they will haul you off to prison. The upside of this unpleasant scenario is that people will keep their agreements and keep the social order out of fear of what will happen if they don't. That's basically Hobbes' formula for how to maintain peace. A country will have peace, he says, if they have a leader capable of maintaining order through the threat of force. Anyone without such a leader is considered to be in the state of nature. A second thing to keep in mind is that when Hobbes uses the term war, especially when he's describing the state of nature as a state of war, he doesn't mean what we usually think of now when we say war. When he's talking about the state of nature on a society-wide level, he means interpersonal conflict or small group conflict. He also means not only the actual fighting, but the threat of fighting and the insecurity from that threat. The state of nature is a picture of total social breakdown because everyone has to constantly be defending themselves. You won't have industry, Hobbes argues, because the fruit of your labor would just get stolen, and nobody has the time to develop arts or sciences because they're all trying to get enough stuff to survive and protect it from everybody else. People did group together in small units like families or form shifting alliances, but there's no large-scale social cohesion and certainly no security. This state of violent insecurity is what Hobbes means by war in the state of nature. And this is what Hobbes is referring to with his famous quote about the life of man being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's not until later on in his theory that Hobbes mentions, almost in passing, that in the international arena, the countries are much like individual people. And if there's no single world leader, the international arena is in the state of nature, or a state of war. Surprisingly, Hobbes did not argue that human nature is violent. His first law of nature is that man should seek peace insofar as peace can be obtained. That's an important caveat, but the point is that Hobbes did not portray humans as inherently violent. What he portrays them as is selfish, and he does this by philosophical proof. Now, he did this in 1651, before the scientific revolution, so it's important to keep in mind that a philosophical proof was the science of the day. And indeed, as we can see in IR nowadays, it still governs massive amounts of behavior. So let's get into how Hobbes proves that humans are selfish. First, he argues that thoughts depend on words. If we can't label something, we can't manipulate it, we can't think about it. Then he points out that words like good and evil mean different things to different people. Honor, virtue, and other moral words have the same problem. Unless there's a leader to establish what those words mean for everyone, individuals will act on their own definitions, and there may as well not be a concept at all. In fact, Hobbes goes so far as to say that there is no such thing as right and wrong, good and evil, or just and unjust in the state of nature, because there's no leader to standardize those concepts. He does. Second, he argues that all voluntary actions stem from imagination. Involuntary actions like your heart beating don't count, but all voluntary actions like eating or walking depend on preceding concepts like what and where. Ignorant people, he says, may think that some actions are spontaneous, but that's just that they happen very fast. They still depend on concepts. So by doing this, he's ruling out what we might call instinctive actions, like jumping in the water to save someone without thinking. Then he demonstrates that all voluntary actions stem from desire or aversion. You either want something or you want to avoid something. You can't act out of will, because will is only the determination to act which comes after you've decided you want to get or avoid something. And Hobbes has already disposed of moral considerations and instinct. So desire and aversion are all that remain. At this point, Hobbes considers his point proven. Since desire and aversion stem from and refer to the self, he concludes that all voluntary actions are self-interested. Then he goes on to substitute the term selfish. So how does selfish mankind then end up in the state of nature? Or the state of war that he calls the state of nature? Well, even though the first law of nature is to seek peace, the second law of nature is man's right to defend himself. We should back up a little here and mention that before Hobbes, there was a philosophical school called the Skeptics, who claimed that there is no universal moral principle. Nothing about human morals or ethics, nothing at all, could be said to apply to all people. Well, this was a very scary proposition for people to consider. So a philosopher named Grotius had an answer. He said that all people everywhere will defend themselves, and he framed that as a moral right. By doing this, he pulled ethics out of the realm of total relativity and gave it something to stand on. So Hobbes is referring to this previously established human universal when he describes man's right to self-defense. Only Hobbes' understanding of self-defense, like his use of the term war, is a little different from the way we use the term today. Today, we understand self-defense as something you do if you're in imminent danger. If someone's about to kill you, for example, and you kill them to save your own life, that's how we understand self-defense today. But for Hobbes, self-defense meant establishing your own security now and in the future. Keep in mind, there's no law, because there's no sovereign to establish the law. There's also no justice, no right and wrong, and no honor. In this situation, Hobbes argues, the right to self-defense means the right to grab other people's property, or even to kill them if it makes your own future more secure. So even though, Hobbes says, most people are peaceful by nature, it is this miserable insecurity that forces them to become aggressive, untrustworthy, and potentially violent. So what is the problem with this logic? I mean, it's still being used by all the world's superpowers and taught in the major universities. And it has lots of adherents who write best-selling books. So clearly it stood the test of time. But I want to argue that it has a crucial flaw. And the flaw is this. Hobbes' proof of selfishness is based on a view of humans as atomistic. By that I mean a being that can be fully separated from his surroundings and fellow beings. But that is not an accurate view of what a human being is. A person is not just a body in space. a person has many parts, including awareness of herself and a sense of who she is. This sense of oneself may be called identity. Identity depends on others. It is constructed through interactions with others, many kinds of others, like people, places, and ideas. To get a sense of this, you can imagine yourself, and then try to imagine yourself without your friends, without ever having known any of them. Then try to imagine who you would be without your parents, without your interactions with them and the influence they've had on you, without your hometown, without the place you live now, without the books you've read and the films you've seen. You can keep going with this until you hopefully realize that there's not much you apart from all these relationships. The way we understand our identity relies on others as well. I understand that I'm a woman because I see other women and I categorize them as a group, and there's some language around it. I know I'm a sister because I see others around me who have this kind of relationship, and it creates a category I can understand, and so on. This identity is multiplistic. I'm not a woman or a sister or an American or against military buildup and war. I'm all of these things. And I choose, according to Nobel Prize winner Maija Jespersen, to move back and forth between these facets of identity according to their importance to me. Sen further makes the point that trying to reduce human identity to one single facet is essential for setting up massive violence, like war in the modern sense. Identity is also a very basic human need. John Burton writes that many, if not the majority, of modern conflicts may be understood in terms of identity, whether it's refusal to recognize or mischaracterization. This is certainly a massive element in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in the issue of Maori rights here in New Zealand, and in the Black Lives Matter campaign back home in the US. In all of these places, we consistently see individuals sacrificing money, time, comfort, personal safety, and even their lives for the sake of what may be substantially represented as identity issues. So we see that to regard a human being as existing only as an atomistic individual who may be understood in isolation is kind of a strange, incorrect construction. And we know from the experiment on that poor baby monkey that being raised in isolation does not reveal some kind of pure form of oneself, but leads to insanity, perhaps because the identity is not allowed to form. The multiplicity of identity and the importance of identity to human beings is important for dismantling Hobbes in two ways. One, it undermines his proof of humans as selfish. He has demonstrated that humans are self-interested, that we will allow. But if a human is more than just a self as individual, but also includes, for example, self as activist, self as Maori, self as father, and other facets of identity, then that person may act in these roles and still be acting in his self-interest, even if those actions contradict or even sacrifice the needs of his self as individual. That means the self-interest, which Hobbes has proven, does not equate to selfishness. And Hobbes' proof of the state of nature really depends on human selfishness. If the state of nature does not obtain on a social level, it also does not obtain on an international level, which means the international arena cannot be said to be in a state of war. This means that war in the modern sense, meaning conflict between armies, cannot be said to have the inevitability that political realists claim for it. The second way that the multiplicity of identity is important in countering Hobbes is because the multiplicity of identity can form the cornerstone of security arrangements that don't depend on force. I'll say that again. The multiplicity of identity can be used to create political systems that don't depend on force for security. One example of this is the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy was a grouping of Native American tribes which had been at war for generations. They got together and decided to stop warring with each other and developed a political system. In it, people were organized into clans. That was the basic political unit. the elder woman of each clan appointed a male representative to sit on the Iroquois Council. But the law was you couldn't marry within your clan. So everyone's identity included, on one hand, this clan, and on the other hand, the family by marriage, which crossed clan lines. This made it impossible for the people to separate into political groups and go to war against each other. This system lasted and kept peace for hundreds of years, assimilating more tribes and growing in size until it was overrun by Europeans who had no interest in joining and who had vastly superior firepower. Ironically, the Iroquois Confederacy would later serve as a model for the European Union. To end, I want to leave you with two questions. The first question is, how can we interrupt the Hobbesian narrative and the continued training in political realism that all the statesmen in the superpowers receive? And the second question is, how can we design tomorrow's states to depend for security not on weapons, but on an updated notion of human identity? Thank you.